Welcome back. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to give you a challenge. We know that the primitive component has an onComponent begin overlap delegate. Well, it has lots of delegates, including an onComponent end overlap delegate. And this works very similarly. The only difference is it's fired off when something stops overlapping with the component. Now, I've given you the skills to figure out what type of callback function can be bound to a given delegate, and how to look into the primitive component header file and see the declarations for the various delegates. Now, I'll be showing you how to do this challenge, but I want you to try first, as this is the best way to learn and get some practice doing this on your own, because that's what it's going to be like when you're making your own games. So here are the steps to the challenge. First, I'd like you to look into PrimitiveComponent.h and search for onComponent end overlap. Look for that declaration for the delegate using one of those big long macros, and figure out the function signature for a callback that can be bound to onComponent end overlap. And once you've figured that out, create the callback function in the item class. Now remember, this has to be a U function, so don't forget your U function macro. Now, you do need to bind the callback, and I'd like you to do this in Begin Play using Add Dynamic, just like you did for onComponent begin overlap. And once you've done this, test out your end overlap function. Print a message in your callback to prove that it's working, and then go and overlap with an item and end overlap and see if you get that message. Pause the video here and give this challenge a try, and then come back and I'll go through the steps as well. All right, so the first step here in the challenge, I'm going to search for PrimitiveComponent.h and open up that header file. And here in the header, I can search for onComponent end overlap. And here is the declaration for the delegate. Now, you might have noticed that these macros tell us how many parameters the callback function can take. We saw that onComponent begin overlap took 6 parameters, but onComponent end overlap says 4 params. So we only have 4 parameters, which means we only need to look at the last 4, as the first thing in the parentheses shows us the type of the delegate. Next, we have the user object for the delegate, followed by the name of the delegate itself, and then the rest are the input parameters for a callback. So now that we know this information, we can create a callback in item.h. And I'm going to place this just under onSphere overlap. It's going to be a void function, and I'm going to call it onSphere end overlap. And we need those input parameters. So from primitive component, I'm going to copy the last 4 and come back to my function and paste them in. Now remember, we do have some extra commas between the types and the names, so I'm going to remove the commas in between each type and name for the input parameter. And now I have a function that has the correct function signature for being bound to onComponent end overlap. And I do need my U function macro to be able to bind it. So I'm going to add the U function macro, and now I can define onSphere end overlap. Now I have a function body, but I do need to bind this to the delegate, and we're going to do that in Begin Play. So just like we did with onComponent begin overlap, we'll do this for onComponent end overlap. So we're going to take our sphere, access its onComponent end overlap, and call add dynamic. Now, sometimes if you type the opening parentheses, it'll try to use internal add dynamic, but we don't need that one. We want the add dynamic macro function. And we're going to pass in this for the user object and the address of our callback, which is called a item onSphere end overlap. So we'll pass that in, and now we have our callback bound to the delegate. And now we can add something here in onSphere end overlap. Now we can easily copy the interior of onSphere overlap and paste it in here. And we can simply change our f string. Now, if you just printed out the name of the other actor and say change the color, maybe to blue, that would be totally fine. But I'm going to show you that strings can be appended, the f string type has the plus operator overloaded. So I can create an f string using the f string constructor like this, passing in a string like ending overlap with, and then I can use the plus operator, and what we're doing is creating a temporary f string object here and adding the other actor's name. So the plus operator will append two strings together. So this expression can be used to assign the value to other actor name. So we should see a blue message when onSphere end overlap is triggered. Now I have my editor closed down, so I'm going to Control F5 to compile and launch the editor. All right, so I'm ready to test this out. And really all I need to do is press play and overlap with the item. Now, as soon as I overlap with the item, I get that red text printing the name of the overlapping actor. Now, I do see that my camera is colliding with that mesh, and we can fix that, but we'll do that in a minute. For now, let's end overlap. So I'm going to step away from the actor, and there's my message in blue, ending overlap with BP/character. So I see that my end overlap is working, and this is great. Now let's talk about that little bit of a camera glitch. That's because the mesh of my item is colliding with the camera. And as we know, we can set its collision response to the different collision object types. So if I go into Blueprints, Items, and open BP item, I can select my item mesh and scroll down to my collision settings, and under collision presets, I can set the collision response to the camera channel to ignore. And now if I press play, I will no longer have that problem where the pyramid is colliding with the camera and making it zoom in like that. So this is great. We now know how to overlap and end overlap with items. And this is pivotal to lots of games. Most games have at least some sort of overlap events working when things happen. For example, this might be an item we want to pick up, like a weapon. And if we overlap with it, we then might wish to be able to pick it up, attach that weapon to the character's mesh, and that's exactly what we're going to do. Now, if we want to do this with a weapon, we need a weapon mesh. But luckily, Quixel Bridge has weapons. I'm going to click this cube icon and open Quixel Bridge. And I can hover over the home icon, select 3D assets, go to props, and under props we have weaponry. And check this out. This is amazing. We have swords and axes and daggers. This is really cool. And I'd like to add a sword to my project. I think this one here looks pretty nice. And we know that we can simply drag one in if we like. And now the sword exists in my project. So now that I have a sword, I can assign that as the static mesh for my BP item. Now I could do this in the BP item default blueprint itself by selecting item mesh and finding its static mesh and searching for sword. And there's that sword from Quixel Bridge. Now it does look kind of small, but that's because my scale for the mesh is set to 0.2 for X, Y, and Z. I can set that back to 1, and now it's at its regular size. And take a look, this is a pretty good looking sword. And if I go back to the test map, I can see the sword here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the static mesh sword, and now I just have my BP item here. And because I scaled up the mesh, the sphere is bigger too. So that's something that happens with attached components. If you scale one component, any other components attached to it will scale along with it. I'm going to move that radius down a bit. And now we have a reasonable sphere radius. And there's a sword. And we know when we're overlapping and when we're not overlapping with the sword, which is super useful because we can program a way to pick up the sword if we're close enough, if we're overlapping with its sphere. So that's going to be our next goal, is picking up that sword, attaching it to our character so it looks like our character is holding the sword. So that's going to be really exciting, and we'll do that in the videos to come. Great job. I'll see you soon.